Hi, friends. Welcome back to the Bare and Brutal podcast, the podcast where we bare our feelings and are brutally honest while highlighting stories of resilience and transforming pain into power. I'm your host, Michelle, and today we have the privilege of speaking with an incredible guest who has navigated significant challenges and just emerged with a powerful mission to support mental health within the Asian American community. Our guest is Angela Wu, a Taiwanese American licensed mental health therapist who has faced burnout, struggled with internalized shame of her culture and identity, and experienced really just the profound impact of discovering her undocumented status during high school. Despite these challenges, she has found a path to reclaiming her cultural identity and now dedicates her work to helping other Asian Americans heal and break generational cycles. She's a freaking powerful guest. So thank you so much for joining us, Angela.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for that intro. What a great intro. Damn.
Well, you deserve it. I mean, you're like an incredible person.
Thanks. Just hype me up.
Yes, that's what we're here for. No, I'm seriously though, just so I can outline for the audience how I discovered your page. Maybe it was you were I think you popped up on my story feed just as like an ad, and I was like, oh my gosh, one, she's so pretty. I clicked on your page and I was like, sassy Asian therapist sounds like exactly what I need. And I think your pinned post talked about your story, and I was like, oh my goodness, let me reach out. Hopefully she'll respond. And you did, and I'm so happy
Yeah,
that
I'm so
we're
glad you
getting to
reached
do this.
out.
Yeah.
Yeah, love being here.
Yeah. Well, I would love it. I know your background, and we've chatted a bit before this, but can you introduce yourself and share a bit about your background, professional journey as a therapist and all that good stuff?
Yeah, so let's start with our shared experiences in our conversation. We both found out that we were former teachers. So I
Yes.
taught in high school in a Title I school in Miami and San Francisco, and it was through witnessing the trauma inside my classroom, the trauma that my students had gone through because of systemic inequities, racial trauma,
Mhm.
gender-based trauma, things like that. I saw how that really impacted their mental health, their behaviors in the classroom, and eventually their ability to really learn.
Yeah.
And so as a teacher, you're not just their teacher, you're like their everything, their therapist,
Yes.
their auntie, their coach, their,
Yes.
chauffeur sometimes. Like I had to pick kids up and drop them off, right? Because they were stuck there. And so finding myself wear all these hats, but really I think found myself in that counseling space in the
Mhm.
classroom. The classroom was our safe haven.
Mhm.
And through things like poetry club or different things that we started, our kids started to feel safe.
Yeah.
And once they were able to feel safe, that's when they started to heal from trauma. And that's when I realized oh my gosh, I feel so limited in what I can do as a teacher in bringing healing. So that's how I pursued my counseling degree.
Mhm.
And I always thought I wanted to work with at-risk youth. So I did work with in Department of Mental Health in LA with at-risk youth and foster youth for quite some time until the pandemic hit, and I saw all this anti-Asian hate
Mm.
and
Mhm.
violence happening. And I thought, oh my gosh, I need to go where that place is. I need to create those those sacred spaces for
Yeah.
my community. So that's when I came out and did my own thing. And that's when the Sassy Asian Therapist was born.
Yeah. Wow. Well, what a journey. Just kind of coming full circle, and I'm so glad that we got to connect and resonate with each other with our stories with teaching, because that's a unique experience in the teaching community to realize the ins and outs that happen when you become a teacher. I feel like people don't know really how many different hats teachers play,
Yeah.
and the roles that we have to juggle. as an
Yeah,
educator.
absolutely.
And I'm so inspired by how you took your work with the students and recognized that need. And same thing, you recognize the need in the Asian community or needing those safe, sacred places that you're talking about. Um,
Yeah.
when we discussed in our conversation, you did mention you kind of had kind of some conflicts when it came to your identity in the Asian community. Can you speak on that a little bit and maybe share um, what it was like growing up for you?
Yeah. So I think I shared this earlier when my professor asked me like what type of population I wanted to work with and serve. I said at-risk youth, people of color, and she's like, "What about Asians?" And I was like, "No," because then and there, I realized I had so much of this internalized racism within me
Mm,
because of my experiences growing up. Right. Growing up as an 1.5 generation immigrant, um, there was a lot of these microaggressions I
mhm,
experienced that I didn't even realize, right?
yeah.
But every time I would experience something, there's this cognitive distance of, oh, like something's off, something in my body feels weird. Something just says to me that I don't belong here.
Mm,
Right. So, growing up with that message and the way that I coped with this not feeling like I belonged was to belong extra, right?
mhm,
Overcompensate in that way. And the way I did that was to assimilate, meaning
yeah.
I just completely threw away my culture and tried to be like a white girl. That was something that
Yeah.
I always wanted to be. I would look in the mirror and was like, I wish my eyes weren't like this. I wish, I
Mm,
had a better looking nose. It wasn't so flat,
yeah.
right? Things like that. And I was like, I just wanted to be white because to be white meant that you weren't bullied, you weren't targeted, you weren't made fun of,
Yeah.
and it meant that you belonged, right? And so I
Wow.
would hide like my whole like Asian world. Like I would hide my parents because they had an accent. I would hide anything like that looked Asian. If
Mhm.
I brought dumplings to school as a second grader and got made fun of, right?
Yeah.
And so since then I was like, I only want Lunchables for lunch, even though Lunchables is like crap,
Yes.
except the pizza one. I do like the pizza one.
Yeah, it is good.
Um, yeah, I like putting on the pepperonis. Um, but yeah, that was when just so growing up feeling like not belonged really propelled me to reject my own culture.
Mhm,
And as an adult, and as I did this work to understand why I did the things I did, I realized that it wasn't because I didn't like my culture, but it was because I felt like that was the only way I could protect myself
mhm.
and protect my family from
Yeah,
being targeted, right?
yeah.
Um, we don't see Asians represented in media, and the type of representation we had is really caricature type,
Mhm.
right? Like whether we know kung fu or we have this fobby accent or
Yeah.
you're this straight A student or whatever. Um, and so because of that, that translates to violence against our communities, right?
Mhm.
Because people think, oh, you're Asian, you'll never complain, I can push you around, I can take advantage of you,
Yeah.
you're the model minority, whatever, right? And so, in extreme cases, that's what led to the violence towards our communities in
Mhm.
during the pandemic.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
how did you how did you come back to your culture? Because you say you completely erased that part of you, hiding it, and I feel like you held a lot of shame, I hear, um, in your identity being Asian. How did you come back to this part of you and grow to love it and find pride in
Yeah.
it?
Yeah. I think in me, there was always something missing,
Mhm.
right? I noticed that every time we talked about like Asian stuff. Like I felt this resistance in my body. Like, I don't want to talk about this. I don't want to talk
Mhm.
about my Asianness. I would even go as far as hiding my passport because for a long time I wasn't a citizen because
Mhm.
of, like you mentioned before, I was undocumented. And when we got our documentation, we had to have our green card for X amount of years. So when I
Yeah.
would travel with friends, like I had a Taiwanese passport and I would always hide it. And even my legal name is Pei Shen. That's my Chinese name.
Mhm.
I would, legally at school, that would be the name. And the first day, like teachers would butcher it, right?
Yeah.
And I would be so embarrassed, like just call me this, call me Angela,
Yeah.
right? And so I noticed that I was avoiding all things Asians because of the trauma that I've experienced growing up.
Mhm.
And also because like a part of me was missing, and even in my relationship with my family, with my parents, right?
Mhm.
They told me like, we always felt like you were embarrassed of us or you were ashamed
Yeah.
of us. And that's when it hit me like, wow, like I must carry a lot of this shame. Like, what
Mhm.
is this? And so it was in therapy actually, and this healing process when I tried to recover parts of myself, understand what was the missing piece, that I realized like, wow, the things that I went through it wasn't just me. Like it's
Mhm.
an actual thing that our communities, people in our communities face.
Yes.
And when I realized I wasn't alone, I was like, okay, let's go full force. Let's dive deep into this. Let's go into the psychology and learn about this.
Yeah.
And when I could start to understand myself, why I did the things I did, not because I was weird, right? But
Mhm.
because it was out of survival,
Yeah.
that's when I started to embrace my identity and
Yeah.
who I am.
Wow. So realizing and kind of separating yourself from your circumstances, right? Like understanding this is not because something's wrong with me
Yeah,
or I'm not good enough. It's because of these external factors. And that was
exactly.
something, yeah, that's powerful.
Yeah.
I want to go back to how you discovered that you and your family were undocumented in high school.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine how did it impact your life, and what were some of like the challenges that you faced with that situation?
Yeah. So I remember it was junior year of high school. And that's, junior year is when everybody's getting their licenses, they're starting to drive. And I already didn't feel like I belonged in that school because those were the schools that rich kids went to.
Mm-hmm.
And, I was the poor kid of that
Yeah.
school. And so everything in me just wanted to belong. I was arguing with my mom in our car after she picked me up from school. I'm like, why can't I get my license? Why can't I get it? It's not fair. And she's like, she said something like, it's because we're illegal aliens.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, what? Like, what does that even mean? I
Yeah.
didn't I didn't know because I'd never really been exposed to that type of language
Mm-hmm.
before. And she's like, it means we don't belong here. Like
Oh.
legally, we can't be here. And I was like, it took a moment for me to register, but in a weird way, there was like a wave of relief that came over me because it explained to me why my parents and my family was so afraid of
Mm,
interacting with, you know, teachers, with
yeah.
doctors, with any kind of officials, the librarians, the people who worked at the grocery stores. They were so afraid every time they had to open their mouth and ask for any type of services
Yeah.
because what if they were found out? Right.
Yeah.
So it explained why growing up there was an undercurrent of fear in my family and why there was a heavy reliance on me as a cultural broker to help my
Mm,
parents navigate a lot of these things. So and also explain why we could never, go to the doctor. When we did go to the doctor, someone was like close to dying,
Yeah.
right? Because
Like
we
it
didn't have
was
health
last
insurance.
resort. Yeah.
Exactly, right? I just remember not having health insurance. My dad needed to have this major back surgery because he couldn't walk. He was having a compressed spine, or a
Mm,
bulging disc. And the only way that he could last was like laying on the floor. He was eating while laying on the floor, and he's a piano tutor, so that requires him to move around, bend around, whatever.
yeah.
And my mom would literally, he's like a huge muscular man, like carry him into this big ass van that we had, like a Dodge Ram camper van, which we never went camping in. And she would take him to work, and he would be in excruciating pain, and just watching my family go through that period. Because
Yeah.
if my dad couldn't work, we didn't eat. We lived off of every single piano that he tuned, right? And so I digress. But being affected because of our status, right? We didn't have the financials, we didn't have the health, just compounded uh even more stress. And later, when I experience some assault, right?
Mm,
I knew I couldn't share any of this stuff because I had to protect my family. And so a lot of this was suffering and silence.
yeah.
Um, and in fact, it made me assimilate even more,
Hmm.
right? I became even more white adjacent. I just did not want in any kind of Asian friends. I was surrounded myself with white people because I thought that if they, saw me in this way, they would never suspect that I was an immigrant, let
Yeah.
alone an undocumented one,
Yeah.
right? So, yeah, long story short, like that's how I found
Yeah.
out.
That is such an incredibly heavy burden to carry as a child. I mean,
Yeah.
you used the term earlier, the being this cultural broker for your family. Um, Having to be the one that your family relies on to, you know, do these very adult things when you're just a kid.
Yeah.
And it makes me emotional, like hearing your story, because I'm just thinking of little Angela in high school, like having to deal with this stuff, and you're carrying this burden, this shame.
Yeah.
Um, wow. What was it like during that time when you experienced the assault? Like,
Yeah.
did you tell anyone? Were you
No.
able to tell anyone? Um, Tell me about that time. Walk me through it.
Yeah. So um, the first one was in freshman year of high school. I was 14 years old, and it was by this guy that was like a super senior. So he was like 19 years
Mm,
old. And it happened on at a nearby, like a feeder elementary school. And, the only reason I believe to this day that it didn't lead to rape was because there was a janitor there. This
mm,
was after school hours, and he saw what was happening, and he yelled at the guy like, "Hey, leave her alone."
yeah.
And that was when he let me go, and I was able to just go home. And also because my dog was there, and my dog was humping his leg, but that's a different story. My dog was trying. He was
We
trying to
love your
help.
dog. Your dog trying to say.
Yeah. And so, okay, yeah, not to make light of this, right? But sometimes you gotta have to,
Yeah, yeah.
you gotta have to, right? Um, but after that, like he didn't disappear from my life. He like stalked me. Like
Mm,
I remember just like having so much anxiety and hypervigilance when I was walking up the stairs, like going through the hallways. I would be afraid that everywhere I turned, like there he was waiting for me. He would show up at my tennis games. And I remember we had a game one day and I was serving, I kept on double faulting because he was sitting right in front of me on the bleachers on the other side. And my coach came up to me and he's like, Angela, what's wrong? Like, why are you playing like this? And I was like, the guy that's sitting across from me harassed me. I didn't even know the words, right?
Yeah.
He's harassing me. And that was the closest I came to ever telling anyone.
Mm.
And she pulled him out from the court and she started to yell at him and he left. But what she should have done was after that, pull me aside and made some sort of report, right?
Yeah.
As a mandated reporter. And she didn't do that. So I was clinically depressed. Like I didn't know that, but I had so much shame. I felt so dirty. I felt like it was my fault.
Yeah.
I couldn't go to my parents because they were already experiencing so much stress that I didn't want to add to their burden. And I just remember like crying every day.
Yeah.
I wanted to just disappear, like hide in a closet, close myself there and never come out. I would fall asleep every like first period during AP Gov, and my teacher hated me probably because he thought I was like just an asshole student. And the sad part is none of my teachers ever noticed. You know, I think like being a teacher, like having been a teacher, like
Yeah.
I notice these things in my kids. I
Yeah.
notice when they're off, when they're going through something, right? And not
Right.
one of my teachers ever asked me, are you okay?
Yeah.
Right. And I can't help that this model minority stereotype played into that,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because Asian students are naturally quiet. They don't speak up. Like,
Yeah.
you know, especially as Asian girls, like that's, I wonder if that's why my teachers never said anything. They
Yeah.
just assumed that that was how I was supposed to be. And teachers are really the front lines of
Right.
identifying these mental health issues with students. And so even more I felt alone. I didn't go to I tried to go to my friends and they didn't believe me.
Oh my
And
gosh.
I just was emotionally abandoned during that time. And so that led to, you know, a really bad coping. The guy stalked me and he was like 21 already. I was still in high school and I was like, well, if you're still going to be here, like I'm going to get you to buy me some alcohol. Because that's the way I cope. So I got
Yeah.
a handle of Jack Daniels and another handle of Southern Comfort hidden under my pillow, under this big like stuffed bear that I had. And every night I would drink, cry, go to sleep, drink, cry, go to sleep. And in the background, I would hear my parents fighting and
Yeah.
financial stressors going on. So that was how I dealt with it and led into like college too, where I self medicated. Like I
Yeah.
just partied as a way to escape.
Yeah.
Right. So to answer your question, how did I cope? I didn't. I didn't until some friends in college were like, you know what? It might be good for you to try seeing a therapist.
Yeah.
And these were my white friends that were like, oh, yeah, we go to therapy. And I was like, what is this? You know, like, our therapist is the best. You should go to him too. And I was like,
Yeah.
okay. So that was my first experience, sophomore year of college, of going to therapy.
Yeah. Wow. Well, good on your friends for being so like, yeah, girl, you need some help
Yeah.
because I feel like during college, you know, everyone's in their party era. They're like, yeah, let's go have our unhealthy coping mechanisms and
Yeah.
go black out.
Yeah.
I I resonate deeply with your story. I mean, not I don't know what it's like being undocumented and having that experience, but um, experiencing assault and not being able to say anything or um, grappling with those feelings like, oh, it's my fault, and
Yeah.
I could have done something to prevent this.
Yeah.
I also, in college, experienced an assault, and
Mm. So-
I actually have not really talked about this. Close friends know, but I'm getting real vulnerable. I have not.
Yeah.
My parents don't know. My family doesn't know. Uh, and in college, I also did not cope with it at all. I think for me, I turned to anger.
Mm.
Um, I was a really angry person. I would take it out on my boyfriend, and I remember I went on like a 3-day bender after it happened. I literally went to party 3 days in a row, got drunk. I'm like at a house party sobbing while I'm drinking some jungle juice.
Yeah. Oh,
And
jungle juice.
yeah.
The bane of my
And
existence.
these girls are like, "Hey, are you okay?" And I'm just like sobbing. But again,
Oh.
it's like at that time, like no one thought any of it. They're like, "Oh, she's just
Yeah.
like a messy drunk, like she's emotional." Um, and yeah, I will have to
Mm.
credit my boyfriend. He was out of his depth with all my things, but he was like, maybe you should talk to someone. He's like,
Yeah.
he also is Vietnamese, and mental health is not a thing in his family. But when he
Mm.
saw, you know, how I was coping, or the lack of coping, he was like, maybe you should try some therapy. I don't know what to do with this.
Yeah.
And I remember I was like, no, like I'm fine. I'm dealing with it. And he
Mm.
was like, well, what if I went? Like if I went, would you go? And
Mm.
that was like, oh, because keep in mind at that time he was like not pro mental health at all. Like he's the stereotypical like, oh, um, men don't cry, like because that's what he grew
Mm.
up with, you know. And so for
Mhm.
him to say, I will go if you go, like that, I was like,
Wow.
okay, this is serious.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I'm so glad to hear that you had influences in your life that
Yeah.
encourage you to go get help, because
Yeah.
um yeah, I don't know where we would be if we didn't go and take that step. So
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I'm so happy you had your boyfriend at that time who really
yeah,
supported you in that way too.
yeah, thank you. I do want to take a moment and ask you though, being undocumented and having that status, it's real. It's a real thing for a lot of people. And
Yeah.
I'm curious, what advice do you have for individuals or families who are currently facing a similar status in those issues?
Yeah. Well, from my experience working in the mental health field in the county, um, we do serve undocumented individuals, and
Mm-hmm.
legally we don't share that status. So you do have resources out there, right? You are able to do that research, find those resources, and right now it's different. I think it's a lot different than when we were. Uh, at least when I was a kid, it was so much hush hush about it. But now,
Mm-hmm.
since like the Dreamers Act, there's been a movement, right? And there have been people uh, who are activists around this. So I would
Yeah.
say, yes, it's a really scary thing, but there are resources out there. Do your research. You don't need to hide.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, that's what I would recommend. Do the research, find those resources. If you Google like Department of Mental Health in your county, you can find free resources for individuals who are undocumented.
Yeah. And I think the most beautiful thing about your story is that now, for young Angela who didn't have people who showed up for her, for a young Angela who didn't have access to these resources, now you are the person who's doing the work, and you're there for
Mm.
people. And I think
Yeah.
that is such a beautiful and full
Mm.
circle thing, that now you're
Yeah.
servicing these people that were you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I also want to talk more about how you've reclaimed your culture as an adult now, going from those feelings of shame, carrying those heavy burdens as a child and young adult, and now you're on this path to reclaim it. Can you discuss what that journey was like for you, or is currently like for you, and what it means to you
Mm.
now?
Yeah. I think reclaiming you, in order to do that, you have to recognize what you've lost, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in order for me to reclaim, I had to grieve a lot of those things first, right? Grieve
Yeah.
the relationship I would have had with my parents,
Mm.
right? Grieve the ability to speak my language,
Yeah.
right? Um, oh, yeah, that's hitting me. Still grieving, right?
Yeah.
Because unless you grieve those things, you're not going to realize just how meaningful they are to
Mm-hmm.
you. You're not going to make that intentional effort to reclaim them. And so, in my journey of reclamation, it's really going to those places that I avoided, like I told you before.
Mm-hmm.
Um, rebuilding that relationship with my parents, learning about how they grew up,
Mm-hmm.
their story, right? And helps me understand like why they did the things they did. Helps me understand who I am, who I come from, right? Understanding that, by understanding that, right, makes me feel like that's when I can start to embrace who I am,
Mm-hmm.
right? Reclaim that piece in me. Other things is like investing in Asian American literature or,
Mm.
films and things like that, just things I never had growing up, right? And
Yeah.
exploring that, or even start to tell my own story without
Yes.
shame, right? Because shame is what took all that away.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I share my story, bear it all, right? I'm telling myself, like, I don't need to hide anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Right? This is not something I'm ashamed of. This is something I'm proud of. And I'm wanting to reclaim it and share it so that people whose stories are similar can also share and own their story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
This is so good. um Thank you so much
Yeah.
for being vulnerable and coming on here and sharing your story, because this is exactly what I aim for with this platform. Is ultimately I want to provide a space for people to release that shame. And I think, one, the work you're doing in your day-to-day is so important. And I know that through your own struggles and your challenges and the grief and all those things, that helps you be so good at what you're doing because you've been there. Um, can you share more about that mission that you have to help people in the Asian community
Yeah.
tackle these mental health issues? Because I imagine mental health was not something openly talked about with your parents growing up.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
That language was like, what? What is that? You're not crazy.
Yeah.
Except I am. No, I'm kidding. Yeah. We're all a little bit. Um, but yeah, like my mission now is the mission to fight shame. I spent my whole life fighting shame, and this is what
Mhm.
I continue to do because until we're able to bring our stories to light and be like, no, this is actually normal. This is not shameful,
Mhm.
right? Then we can have this collective story and know that we're not alone in this, right? Like our healing is not just ours, but it
Mm-hmm.
is communal. It is for our communities. It is for our families. I always say that healed relationships heal relationships. So when you
Mm,
start from your own relationship with yourself, right, then you're going to have healed ways of interacting with people.
right.
And in your healed ways of interacting heals other people, right? And it becomes this ripple effect.
Yes.
And so my mission is to normalize what we're going through as Asian American, um, so that we can even start to dip our toes into this type of healing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. What would you say are the common challenges that you see Asian American clients deal with, and how do you help them address those challenges?
Yeah, so a lot of clients that I see, they're women, Asian American women, usually first or second generation, eldest daughters,
Mm,
who have, just like me, grew up being the translator, cultural broker, um, who have experienced anxiety, burnout, depression, and even trauma. And so a lot that I see them deal with is this strong sense of not just shame, but also this guilt, right? This
mm-hmm.
guilt that ties them back into um, these unhealthy patterns that they're stuck in.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's like, I feel guilty if I say no, I feel guilty if I'm not um, helping my family.
Mm,
And that turns internalized, becomes shame because it says, I am bad. I'm not a good daughter. I let people down, right? That's shame when it becomes your identity. And
yeah.
so my work with my clients is to combat this shame, combat this guilt, because that leads to anxiety and
Mm-hmm.
depression.
And I think that this shame and like the self-sacrifice is
Mm,
something that's deeply embedded in Asian culture. I mean, I witnessed my mom growing up being like the black sheep of the family and always glorifying like putting others before yourself. And
mhm.
that is something that I myself internalized too. Like growing up, I was like, oh, you know, it is selfish for me to um, want to do things that are going to make me happy because
Yeah,
my mom didn't get that privilege. I mean, why should I you know why should I be depressed or have anxiety, which are real
mhm.
things. I mean, chemical imbalances in my brain, but I don't have a right to feel this way because my mom literally came over to America when she was 12 and
Yeah,
went through way worse things than I did. So what right do I have to feel this? Like I should be grateful. I should be,
right.
I'm privileged to be here. But um, that in turn, like you said, it turns into this shame and like this guilt. Um,
Mhm.
and I struggle with that a lot. I'm still healing that in itself for myself, but
Yeah,
I'm curious, have
yeah.
you experienced that as well? Do you see that a lot in clients that you work with?
Absolutely. It's almost like they don't give themselves permission to feel because of how much trauma their parents went through,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, if my mom can survive genocide and never complain or feel sad, then what right do I have to
Yeah.
even complain about work or
Yeah.
whatever? I should be grateful that I even have a job, right? Um, and I think that makes sense because that's a adaptive mindset that's passed on through intergenerational trauma, right?
Mm-hmm.
This notion of I can't tend to my emotional needs because that's what our parents had to do. They couldn't because they had to focus on physical survival.
Yes.
And when you just need like to be physically alive or you need food on your table, there's no space for your emotions,
Right.
right? And it works because That's how you survive war. That's how you survive trauma,
Yeah.
right? When you, though, are no longer in a trauma state and you have that adaptive mindset that they had, you are almost willing yourself to be in that survival mode. So you are almost traumatizing yourself by thinking in that way, right? And our parents had to rewire their brains in a way that helped them survive so that we can wire our brains in a way that helps us live, right?
Yeah.
Even though they may not understand that because the way they think has to have shifted. So actually, when we tend to our emotional needs, right, that is standing on our parents' shoulders and saying, the sacrifice that you have made, it paid off because now I can focus on my emotional needs.
Wow.
Something that you never could. I can live.
Yeah. Have you had conversations about this with your parents, like with your mom? Have you had vulnerable conversations about mental health with them?
Yeah, absolutely. Oof. I mean, we had many a fights. It was messy,
Naturally,
very
yeah.
tense at the dinner table. I would say things got worse before they got better because all this stuff had to come out. All my anger, all my
Yeah.
pain and sadness had to come out. And I had to know that they heard me before we can move on, right? And I did finally, a couple of years, tell my mom about my sexual assault. And the way she responded to me, it was like she looked me in my eyes. Whew, I'm getting emotional. And she just said, "This is not your fault. This was not your fault. I'm so sorry that I couldn't be there for you. But I want you to know that this is not your fault." And that healed me. My mom healed me. That was what I needed at that time, in that moment, that I didn't get. Because my parents, they themselves were in a place of pain, right? But I got it, 10 something years later. That was the first time I really felt seen by my parents. So yeah, we had many conversations, and I think even now, as I have these conversations with my parents, they're exploring it for themselves. My mom's like, she's always tries to be this perfect mom. She has this really strong inner critic, and she's like, why do I need to be like this? I don't need to be so hard on myself, right? And she's learning how to give herself permission to combat that guilt and shame. She's giving herself permission to rest, right? And realize that her identity isn't just wrapped up in her husband or in her children. Like, she doesn't need to self-sacrifice, that she can treat herself, right? That she can just chill and rest and relax and just be, right? Without having to give all the time.
Yeah. Oh, man.
Should have brought some tissues. My God.
I know. I'm so happy to hear that you had that moment with your mom and that she could provide that healing for you and hold space. Because that, I think for myself, I struggled a lot with kind of discounting or underestimating my mom being able to handle certain things. Like, for the longest time, I was like, oh, there's no point for me to have these conversations with my mom because she's just going to react how she always does, like, invalidate and say, why are you sad? Why are you crying? And I recently had an experience with my mom, much like yours, where I sat down and had a conversation with her, and I think I approached it differently this time. I think back in college, I still had so much anger and resentment towards her that I just like completely dismissed her. I was like, mom's not gonna that conversation's not gonna go anywhere. And so naturally, when you come into conversation thinking that, I came off very standoffish, and so my mom came back, just as defensive.
Mm.
And so now, as I've grown this time in this conversation, I was really intentional in like, I am coming at this with peace, right? I'm not here to blame my mother. And I told her, I was like, I don't blame you. I just want you to understand
Yeah.
where I'm coming from, why
Wow.
what I felt like during those times.
Yeah.
And that was such a breakthrough conversation with her. This literally happened like 3 weeks ago. And
Wow. Wow.
we literally hashed out so many things from the past, gosh, like 7 years
Hmm.
worth of pent up things that we just never talked about things. Like I'm pretty close with my mom, but we always keep it like we never touch these things. It's always like swept under the rug. And um
Hmm.
yeah. So I think another part, if I could give anyone in this situation where they're conflicted on whether to have these tough conversations with their parents, is like, give them a chance.
Yeah.
Um
Yeah.
if, I had to mourn the fact that I'm not going to have the kind of relationship that I one romanticize people having with their moms,
Hmm.
and mourn that kind of ideal relationship that I had in my mind,
Yeah.
but also at the same time realize, like, yes, my mom is like this. Maybe she's not going to change, but at the same time, how can I expect any kind of change if I don't give her the opportunity to?
Right.
And so, it sounds like that's something that you also did, like being open and also persistent too
Mm.
in going through and having those tough conversations with parents, because it's not just going to be one. You're going to argue, there's going to be conflict, because this is new for them too. So
I mean, what a beautiful story that you have. And I'm just imagining how much your mom needed to hear those words of like, I don't blame you. Because I wonder
yeah,
if she herself, right, blames
yes,
herself for a lot of these things that criticizing and maybe even not feeling enough like a good mom or whatever. And
yes,
when we already have this internal blame going on, we're going to be very defensive and not open to hearing more.
mm-hmm,
But you sort of let her defenses down by saying like, I don't blame you, and you saw her heart, right? And when
yeah,
you were able to honor her heart, it was then okay, now I can hold you, responsible for some of these things. I know that
mm-hmm,
it comes from a place of good intention,
mm-hmm,
but there was still also that damage or the impact of it,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And it's just so beautiful hearing that too, because it seemed like a part of you had to heal first, right? In
yes,
order to get to that conversation. And what's interesting is when we are hurt, right, and we have unresolved pain, we are sort of frozen in time.
mm-hmm,
So if you hadn't moved on, like processed, some of the things that you have processed, you would have just seen your mom as frozen in that time period as well, right? Which
yes,
makes you less likely to give her that opening, that opportunity, right?
mm-hmm,
But as you heal, you're moving from that time, you're unfreezing yourself, and thus changing your view of what your mom is too, by
yeah,
recognizing like she may also have grown since that time as well.
wow, yes.
Yeah.
Well said, so well explained too. um you're right. I mean, I think that anger that I felt for so long was coming from like 16-year-old Michelle,
Yeah.
who had all that hurt, and I thought, nothing's ever going to change.
Mm.
Um, but I'm so glad that I got to put in some work, and the work is never done. It's still a process, right?
Mhm.
Um, well, thank you so much for also validating my experiences too.
Yeah, of course.
um, this is probably how we're going to wrap up the episode, but I want to know what are some of the key takeaways or messages that you would like the listeners to gain from your story and your experiences today?
Yeah, I think a key takeaway is that healing is not selfish, right?
Mm,
Um, Again, like we talked about, oftentimes we feel like when we pursue something that is our own, it feels selfish because of what our parents went through. If we
mhm.
complain or if we share our emotions or even validate them, it's like we can't because we compare it to the trauma that our parents experienced. But recognizing that they went through that so that we can complain, quote unquote,
Yeah.
complain, right?
Yeah.
They went through that so that we can heal. They may not recognize it, right? Because in their minds, they still have to have that survival mentality. And oftentimes they don't have the resources to be able to unwire that, right?
Mhm.
But know that as you heal, you're going to heal them. You're going to have healed ways of interacting with them. And that's very much my experience. That opens up an opportunity for your parents to look inward,
Mhm.
right? When they see the work happening within you, right? So healing's not selfish. Another one is you don't need to hide in shame, right? Your story is powerful. And the more you share your story, the more people can connect to it. And the
Yeah.
more you'll realize that you're actually not alone.
Mhm.
You're not alone in this. There's nothing wrong with you, right? And you're okay as you are. And in fact, this story is actually going to give you more authority to do the work that you want to do, which is, at least for me, reach out to people who are
Yeah.
hurting, right?
Right.
Because if I need to understand how to heal from the hurt, I need to tap into my own hurt as well,
Mhm.
right? And so it seems scary, but it's less scary than you think it is.
Yeah.
And so you don't need to hide, and your story is powerful.
Thank you for for that message. I mean, for the listeners, but for me, um, this whole conversation is just healing in itself. I feel like I say that every episode with a guest, but it really is. And just thank you. I have so much gratitude for you coming on here and sharing your experiences with us.
Yeah.
Before we go, how can the audience connect with you and learn more about your work?
Yeah. So you can find me on social media. My IG is The Sassy Asian Therapist, or you can go to www.thesassyasiantherapist.com. You can reach out to me that way. Um, you can listen to this podcast and reach out to me this way too. So if you're looking to start your own mental health journey, if you're looking for empowerment coaching, I help individuals break out of people pleasing, perfectionism, and imposter syndrome, which, I would say are, patterns that fuel this model minority stereotype. And so that's my greater mission of dismantling that so that our communities are not taken advantage of, so that we can show up as our authentic self and know that that's enough. So if that sounds like you and something you'd be supported by, feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for coming on the show today. Again, I'm going to express this gratitude indefinitely because the fact that you've taken time out of your day to be a guest and share so openly and vulnerably, and
Yeah.
provide the audience with advice, it's been amazing. So, those of
Hmm.
you listening, if you'd like to follow along with Angela's work as a mental health therapist, educate yourself further on healing trauma, or even find resources for yourself. Her page is amazing, a great resource. So please go over there and show her some love. You can find all of her socials and links all in the show notes. Yeah, so be sure to check it out. Thanks again,
Thank
Angela.
you. Thank you so much for having me and creating space for my story.
Of course. Well, thank you everyone for listening. And as always, I will talk to you soon. Bye.